Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and with your busy schedule and the short time that we asked you to come. Obviously, the man of the hour is here to speak to you. My name is Robert Stovall. I'm the Bexar County Republican Chairman, and we asked you here today to have a close presence with the senator and listen to what he's talking about. And today is the day of first day of early voting. March 4th is voting day. Y'all are the future of this country and the future of Bexar County, basically, and the direction that we're taking. So we love having you here. We love your input, and please give a warm welcome to Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you, Robert. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate your being here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes, and then I just want to open it up for Q&A, and let's have a conversation about whatever issues are on your hearts, whatever issues y'all want to talk about. What I will tell you very briefly is that my top priority in the Senate is focused very directly on one thing, and that is bringing back growth, economic growth and jobs. And the reason is simple, which is that as I travel around the state, I spend a lot of time trying to listen to what Texans want. And last year we did roughly 100 events all over the state, and it doesn't matter where in Texas you are. You can be in East Texas, West Texas, you can be in the Panhandle or the Valley. When you talk to Texans, their top priority over and over again is jobs and economic growth. And so that has been my focus from day one. And I'll tell you, there's no group for whom that is more important than young people. If you look at right now, y'all are in school, as I understand it, about half the group in high school, half in college. Is that right? Where people are, you guys are getting ready to head out into the workforce in a serious way. And having a vibrant economy, having opportunities, is the single most important thing that's going to make a difference for your ability to provide for your family, to gain skills, to provide a better environment for your kids. And, the last 5 years, we have seen a consistent stagnation in this country. From 2008 to 2012, our economy grew on average 0.9% a year. There is only one other period since World War II of 4 consecutive years of less than 1% average growth. And that was from 1979 to 1982. That was coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration, and it was the same failed economic policies. It was out of control spending and taxes and regulation. And every time the government's gone down that road, the result has been the same, which is economic growth drives it. And so my view is we need to have the sort of environment, actually the sort of environment we've been blessed to have in Texas. Texas is an oasis compared to the rest of the country of having vibrant jobs where we can see where small businesses can prosper and thrive and create jobs. It opens up opportunity. That's why you got people from all over the country moving to Texas, because Texas is where the jobs are. And we need to have that kind of opportunity on a nationwide basis. That's what I'm fighting to do. And I appreciate y'all's being engaged in speaking up for economic growth, for liberty, and for the Constitution. And with that, I'm going to answer or dodge any question you like. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, first of all, very much for being here. My question is that you are in a very unique position right now as a younger politician in comparison to most of the others. To revitalize a party that has in many respects been taken on a characterization of old, ugly, kind of tying us backwards in many ways.
Don't sugarcoat.
What's your plan for continuing to revitalize that, and what can we do to help you do that?
It is a great question. It's an interesting experience serving in the Senate. I remember early on, first few months I was there, we were having some policy battle. I don't remember what it was. And one of the senators who'd been there a long, long time stood up at lunch and began yelling at me. And he looked at me and said, "We were fighting about this in 1984. Where were you in 84? And I was sitting there going, in junior high? Sorry, I wasn't part of the fight up here then. I didn't actually have that quip. I thought it, but I didn't in fact say it out loud. I let discretion let me bite my tongue. Look, it's a great question. You're right that the party is perceived. You look at the last two presidential elections, and the Republican Party was painted as the party of old, fat, rich white guys. And Democrats are everyone else. Now, if that's true, you can't win an election that way. There are just not enough old, fat, rich white guys to win an election, and no one wants to. But that's the picture that's painted. Now, I think the answer to turning that around is twofold. It's substance, and it's how we communicate. On substance, I think the single biggest lie in politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich. It is an absolute lie, but it is repeated by the media over and over and over again. Truth of the matter is, the rich do great with big government. Big business loves big government. They crawl in bed with big government. They have armies of lobbyists and lawyers and accountants. The top 1% of our country, the millionaires and billionaires the president loves to demagogue, right now they earn a higher share of our national income than any time since 1928. The president's talking about income inequality. I think it's great. Income inequality has increased under President Obama. He ought to be talking about income inequality and everything he's done to hurt it. Because the truth of the matter is, when you pound small businesses with $1.7 trillion in new taxes, with massive regulation, the people who get hurt are not the gazillionaires. The titans of industry. If you were flying in a private jet 5 years ago, you're still flying in a private jet. The people who get hurt are people like my dad 56 years ago. When my dad came from Cuba, he grew up in Cuba. He fought in the revolution as a teenager. When he was 14, he became a guerrilla fighting the Cuban Revolution. And he was thrown in prison and tortured as a kid by the Batista regime. And when he fled Cuba, he came to Texas in 1957 to go to the University of Texas. And he washed dishes, made 50 cents an hour to pay his way through UT. And went on to get a job, ultimately start a small business. And I try to think in terms of the challenges, the policy issues we're facing. I try to think of all of them from the perspective of my dad, back when he was washing dishes. If my father were still washing dishes today, there's a very good chance he would have lost his job because of the massive taxes and regulations that have been hammering small businesses. If he hadn't lost his job, the odds are incredibly high. He would have had his hours forcibly reduced to 28, 29 hours a week, because the threshold for Obamacare is 30 hours a week. And the problem is, you can't feed your kids. He couldn't have paid his way through UT on 28, 29 hours a week. And one of the things I like to talk about is, look, he started out washing dishes. Why did he wash dishes? Because he couldn't speak English. And you didn't have to speak English to wash dishes. You just had to stick a dish under hot water. He could do that. When he learned English, he got promoted. His second job was as a cook. Same restaurant, made a little bit more money as a cook. His third job was as a teaching assistant at UT, where he taught math to undergrads. His fourth job was as a computer programmer at IBM. And he went from there to starting a small business, a seismic data processing company in the oil and gas business. Now, if he doesn't get that first job washing dishes, the second, third, and fourth job never come. And so substantively, in terms of how do we communicate the message, we need to be the party that's talking about opportunity. For a long time, I've championed what I call opportunity conservatism, that everything we think about, we talk about, ought to focus on those who are struggling to climb the economic ladder, ought to focus on the people who are working towards the American dream. And the truth of the matter is, when you have big government, the people who have been hurt under the Obama economy, they've been young people, they've been Hispanics, they've been African Americans, they've been single moms. They've been the people who are struggling. Now, the second half of that, that's the substance. The second half of it is communication. How many Republicans even talk about issues like this? We don't talk about it.
Socialists who tend to override.
Well, and that is by design of the media. They want to distract. The Democrats want to play a game of smoke and mirrors where they want to distract people from the fact that these economic policies are not working and millions of Americans are hurting. And I think we need to communicate this substance relentlessly. And this is actually where y'all can play a critical issue. Is communicate creatively. We need to use tools like social media, use tools like humor to communicate. Let me tell you, each one of you can reach out to young people 1,000 times better than I can. Each one of you has an ability to reach out to your peers, to your friends, to your families, to your colleagues in a way that is much more effective. And we need to tell the story of freedom. And I think that is the key to winning elections, but it's also the key to turning the country.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lavinia Bindandi. I'm the president of the College Republicans at Trinity University.
Oh, terrific.
What do you expect and what do you hope for from the Republican primaries in Texas next month?
A very good question. I'm actually going to lose my jacket as well, if you don't mind. A very good question. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball on that. I think it's going to vary race by race. And I'm a big believer in the grassroots, in the power of the political process. I'll point to the race, my race for Senate. When we started the race, you remember January 2011, practically nobody in the state thought I had a prayer. When we started, I was at 2% in the polls. The margin of error was 3%. That's actually our real poll numbers. I came home, I was all excited. I told my wife, Heidi, I said, we're at 2%. She looked at me and said, well, technically, couldn't you be at negative 1%? Like, thank you, sweetheart. And, it was an interesting race. It was a $50 million primary. It's the most expensive primary in the whole country. And we were outspent 3-1. Y'all may remember if you turned on the television anytime spring of 2012, there was $35 million of nasty attack ads being run against us. Midway through, Heidi's watching all of those. She turns to me and says, goodness gracious, I didn't know you were such a rotten guy. But what happened in that race was really incredible. We started out with first a dozen, then a couple of dozen, then 100, then 1,000, then a couple of thousand, then tens of thousands of grassroots activists. It was young people. It was Tea Party leaders. It was Republican women. It was business leaders. It was people on the ground. I remember we did an event down in the valley. And it was on a Saturday. It was being held in the fellowship hall of a local church. There had about 300-400 people there. It was a good crowd. And the chairman of the Republican Party there began the event by saying, usually when people come to the valley, they do a fundraiser at the country club for $1,000 a head. He said, Ted is not here for that. He is here to listen to you, to talk to you. This is not a fundraiser. He wants to hear your concerns. Listen to what you have to say. And I got up. I said, listen, Javier, I appreciate the very kind introduction, the reception. Thank you for that. I got to disagree with one thing you said. You said, this is not a fundraiser. Everything we do is a fundraiser. I said, listen, if there's anyone here who can write a $5,000 check, God bless you. We need the money. Thank you. But if you can't, everyone here can give $25 or $50 or $100. And what I would say to that crowd is, I said, look, there's a reason for that. If you're in high school, $25 is 2 pizzas. The reason for that is if you give $25, you got skin in the game. Suddenly it's not abstract, you're invested in it. And if you contribute, you're more likely to talk to your friends, you're more likely to talk to your family, you're more likely to show up and vote and make sure other people vote. And so we did that over and over and over again. And what we saw was this grassroots army that began knocking on doors, sending emails, getting on Facebook, getting on Twitter, making phone calls. And we went from 2% in the primary to not just winning, but winning the primary by 14 points and winning the general by 16 points. I mean, it was an unbelievable testament to the power of the grassroots. So we look at primaries now. There are a lot of contested races. I'm largely staying out of them because, in my view, I think the grassroots can figure out the right answer in races, and I think every candidate owes it to the grassroots to go stand in front of them, to answer hard questions, to say, here's why I'm fighting for the principles you care about. And so, listen, I would like to see strong conservatives elected who will stand up and make a real difference, but I also think that the rise of the grassroots, which the Senate race in 2012 was an incredible demonstration of, it is one of the best dynamics we've got in the country. Yeah.
Given the current state of the country and what we've been founded on with the Constitution and biblically even, what do you think is the path to get back to that point? And also I want to say, contrasting what I think probably everybody in this room admires of your standing up for our country, and also the other side of that coin, which is how do you win the hearts and minds to what we all believe is really the best position to stand in politics as just being a conservative, and how do you contrast that, and what direction do you think we're going?
I think it's a great question. And I think I'm actually very encouraged about where we are. I am optimistic and hopeful. Now on one level, you're going to be sitting there going, are you friggin' out of your mind? Look, we've got the lowest labor force participation in the country since 1978. We are seeing our constitutional liberties under assault from the federal government. We're seeing a president who has been utterly lawless in a way that is profoundly dangerous to individual liberty, to the Constitution. So why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because of what we just talked about a minute ago, because of the rise of the grassroots. The answers to turn this country around are not going to come from Washington. They're going to come from the American people. And the rise of the grassroots is something that is playing out powerfully over and over again. It has D.C. terrified. I've said a bunch of times, the biggest divide in politics, I think, is not between Republicans and Democrats. It is between entrenched politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. And there are far too many elected officials in Washington who just aren't listening to the American people. Every poll that is done of the American people says the top priority of the American people is economic growth. The 13 months I've been in the Senate, we have spent essentially zero time even talking about economic growth. Harry Reid's Senate, it is not a priority, won't be talked about. No wonder Congress is at 13% approval rating, if they don't even talk about the top priority of the people that elected them. So how do we turn it around? And this is something where young people, listen, y'all are on the front lines. And I think where we are right now is very, very similar, eerily similar to the late 1970s. The late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was in the White House. We had the same failed economic policies, and we had miserable economic conditions. Double-digit unemployment, 22% interest rates, gas lines going around the block. And what happened? And by the way, the Washington establishment was every bit as out of touch in the late 1970s as they are today. And what happened across the country was a grassroots movement that became the Reagan Revolution. And it was millions of men and women, and frankly, it was a lot of people who'd never been involved in politics, who looked up and said, listen, what we're doing, it isn't working, it isn't making sense. Let's get back to the free market principles, to the constitutional liberties that have been the foundation for this country. And that transformed the country. When Reagan ran, it's worth remembering, Reagan primaried a sitting Republican president in 1976. Gerald Ford was the incumbent Republican president. I want you to think about how radical that is. to take him on in a primary, the sitting Republican president, and Reagan said, we need to stand for principle, and Gerald Ford's not doing that. And he came within a hair's breadth of beating him in the primary. Imagine if Obama had lost the primary in 2012. That's what Reagan almost did to Ford. And the reaction from D.C. was hysteria. It's worth going and Googling the quotes of everyone saying Reagan was this crazy cowboy from California. He was reckless. He was extreme. It was a travesty. And yet what Reagan did is he fought alongside a grassroots army that brought the party back to the principles we should have been standing for in the first place, to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that we should have stood for to begin with. So how do we turn the country around? It's the same thing. I mean, what I am devoting the vast majority of my energy to doing is trying to mobilize and energize the grassroots. And I got to tell you, young people, look, young people are the only ones crazy enough to put the time and energy in. You know, back in 99 and 2000, I worked on the George W. Bush presidential race in 2000. I actually met my wife on the campaign. So we were both on the campaign staff. We were one of 8 marriages came out of the campaign. So any of y'all looking for a spouse, join a campaign. It actually works real well because you get a bunch of young people. You work them 18, 20 hours a day. You're sleep deprived. You're full of adrenaline. And things happen. But look, it is young people that have the passion to communicate, and most Republicans in Washington don't have any clue about social media, don't have any clue about communicating a message. Every one of you, I guarantee you, right now sitting here is better than most Republican senators at communicating a message to young people. Sitting there right now. And you get Republicans, they'll sometimes like, okay, we need social media. Hire someone to do the Tweety stuff. Sadly, I'm not making that up. But part of, think of the 2 Republican politicians who in modern times have most excited young people. They're Ronald Reagan and Ron Paul. Now, neither one of them was a James Dean, sort of rugged young guy. I mean, they were both septuagenarian, they could have been most of our grandfathers or great-grandfathers. But what did they do? Both of them stood for principle. Look, I remember I was a kid. I was 10 when Reagan was elected president. And it was inspirational. I was 18 when he left the White House. So I grew up watching Reagan, and it was inspirational as a young person to see someone stand for principle and to paint a vision of America that was inspirational in terms of where we could go. You talk about all the people not standing up. You're right. Listen, a lot of folks in Washington think the way you win an election is you don't stand for anything, you don't rock the boat. That's the way you get killed. It doesn't work. The way you win elections is you draw a line in the sand. That's right. And you demonstrate the race matters. One of the people I've always been fond of is Phil Graham. Phil Graham repeatedly did exactly that. Drew a line in the sand. So, for example, Phil Graham, when he introduced Reagan's budget in the early 80s as a Democrat, he decided to switch over to being a Republican, except he did something very different. He resigned from Congress and said, I'm going to run again as a Republican because the people didn't elect me as one. Now that kind of, and you know what? He got overwhelmingly elected because they respected what he was doing. You give people a reason it matters in their life. And I think that's how you win elections, is making a clear principled stand that matters. You look at 2008 and 2012, millions of people stayed home. They stayed home because they said, what the heck does it matter? That's what we've got to change. Yeah.
Senator, basically answered my question. I'm Matt McCall's campaign manager, and Matt's running against Lamar Smith. So I really appreciate what you said about growing pains and going through the grassroots, because Matt wouldn't have grown as a speaker or as a politician if he hadn't had to kind of work his way up. But I'm curious, with the popularity you have right now, you kind of have the name recognition to probably attach your name to anybody and have them get elected. And you're going to need strong conservatives in the House of Representatives, because there's only like 64 of them right now. So my question was, why don't you endorse people? But you pretty much answered that. I'm going to ask also, though, if Matt gets into a runoff, would you consider endorsing him?
Look, I will look at every race.
Okay.
I think it is likely that I am going to stay out of incumbent congressional races. And that has been, it's interesting. That's a position that has managed to infuriate people on both sides of things. I will tell you, there's no one else in the Senate doing that. It is viewed as a radical position not to be endorsing fellow incumbents. And listen, incumbents have massive advantages. They don't need my support to get reelected. Where I'm focusing my energy is on open seats, because I think and hope I can play an important role in open seats. I think incumbent races matter a lot. But at the end of the day, I'm going to leave it to the grassroots to drive. Yeah.
Every time I pull up an article on you, with your face there, and I see what goes on in the Senate, and it's just they block everything that comes through. Not too long ago they had the San Antonio ordinance with the sexual orientation, transgender, and I look and I see that you have 10 councilmen and you have the mayor who didn't pass the bill, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that the majority is indeed not homosexual, and these representatives are to represent the districts, and given that, of course, my confession is I was there with the ordinance, and they even confessed themselves that we're voting on the spirit, and then Elisa Chan rebuked and said we're not supposed to vote on spirit, we're voting on law. And so I see them, of course, they legislate this, and I'm like, really? So we're subjected to this ordinance, which is one that was unlawful, and I get upset with that. I also get upset when I see these things going on, at the Capitol. And I just want to ask you a question. At what point do you feel like enough is enough? Like, if they're willing to not listen to the people, like no matter what we say or how we contact them, and they don't listen to us. I mean, my question would be, when you look at Obama and how abusive he is with his power, I mean, when I look at him, I'm like, man, it's crazy, and so I just want to ask, like, have you ever contemplated, given his abusiveness as a president, almost like as that of Great Britain and America in the Civil War? Have you ever contemplated like a revolution?
Look, it is a great question. I suspect there is not a Texan who would say they have never contemplated such a thing. Sam Houston famously says, Texas has yet to learn submission to oppression, come from what source it may. But that being said, I think the right answer is to take the country back. And it's, I remember a few years ago, Rick Perry got in a little bit of heat because someone asked him about secession. And he said, well, that's something to the effect of, well, maybe we ought to think about that. And it was interesting on the campaign trail. That's a question you get asked. Should we secede from the Union? And I'll tell you what I would say repeatedly in answer to that is, look, I understand where that's coming from, and there are times when I feel that frustrated. But I love this country too much for us to leave. I think Texas has a responsibility to stand up and fight to bring this country back. And I'll point out to you, you know, it looks dark. Famously said, what makes you think that a small group of determined individuals can change the world? Answer, it's the only thing that ever has. The power of the men and women in this room to make a difference is enormous. And so listen, is it frustrating and maddening? Yes, but you know, when Jimmy Carter was president, he told the country, accept malaise, accept second-class citizenship. We cannot keep up with the Soviet Union. You want to read an interesting speech, read his, I think it's 1977 speech on energy, where he tells everyone we need to accept the fact that we're going to run out of oil by the mid-1980s. It's worth reading this speech because every single word in the speech is wrong, including, I think, and thee. And he tells everyone, we need to sacrifice, which whenever a politician says, we need to sacrifice, number one, the we always means you. And number two, somehow it is always your life going down, your family doing with less, and paying politicians and giving them more power to do more. Things looked dire, but let me tell you how fast things turned around. You had 4 years of growth less than 1%, 79 to 82. By the fourth year of Reagan's presidency, our economy was growing at a rate of 7.2%. Because he came in, look, the economic programs that work are cutting taxes, simplifying the tax code, reducing the tax burden, reducing regulations that kill jobs, that kill small businesses, and getting out of the way and letting the private sector create jobs. If Barack Obama, coming into office 5 years ago, inheriting the same lousy economy Ronald Reagan had implemented the same economic policies, and the same economic growth had resulted, by today, we'd have an additional 7 million new jobs. That's the equivalent of taking every single person who's unemployed in 46 of the 50 states and finding a new job for all of them. That's the power of a grassroots movement from the people. So I understand that frustration, but what I would urge is channel it into speaking up to take the country back for the people. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. Many of us are here because we are emboldened by the tenets of conservatism, free enterprise, limited government, and individual freedom. And we want to get involved in our communities, to continue promoting these ideals. However, as young professionals, we do not have the financial wherewithal to withstand investigation by the IRS. How do we become more engaged in our own government without fear of repercussion?
You know, what a sad statement. That's a real question. Listen, what this administration is doing is wrong, and it is abusive. I will tell you it has been more directed to date at organized groups seeking tax exemption and or major financial donors and or funders. At the end of the day, even the federal government right now lacks the resources to go after the American people one at a time. So I do think at the level of grassroots organizing, of reaching out to young people, I don't think there is a significant danger of individualized retaliation. But, you know, look, it is one heck of a statement that people are, for good reason, genuinely concerned about that. I mean, I can tell you the two things that wake me up every day are fighting for economic growth because it is critical to opportunity, and fighting for our Constitution. And the abuse of power and the threat to our constitutional liberties has been enormously dangerous, and we need to speak out about it. It's something I have been trying to do over and over again, and I think it is important to shine the light on how precious. You know, Reagan famously said, liberty is not passed down in the bloodstream from one generation to the next. Every generation has to stand up and fight for freedom, or one day we will find ourselves answering to our children and our children's children. What was it like when America was free? I mean, that's why y'all are here, because you're fighting, because I feel very certain no one here wants to answer that question from your children or your children's children. And we can stand up and do it just like previous generations have. All right, I'm getting the hook, so one last question. All right.
First of all, thank you. My name is Stefana Diaz. I go to Northeast Vista. I'm also the youngest Republican precinct officer. Thank you. My question to you is, with the number of people on food stamps rising, what is your plan to reduce the government on spending on welfare?
It is a terrific question. And, you look at you've got 1 in 7 Americans right now on food stamps. It's heartbreaking. And listen, as Republicans, this goes back to what I talked about before, opportunity conservatism. We need to be focusing every day on expanding opportunity for those who are struggling. And dependency is incredibly corrosive. Listen, I'll tell you what I've said many times. When my dad was a teenager, washing dishes at 50 cents an hour, thank God some well-meaning liberal didn't come up to him and put his arm around him. Say, let me make you dependent on government. I'm going to send you a check every month. And by the way, don't bother learning English. I respect your culture so much, I'm going to lock you out of the professional educated classes in this country. I mean, that would have been a travesty. There's the old adage, give a man a fish, you teach him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a life. We need to be championing teaching people to fish. For the people who are on food stamps, for the people who are on welfare, if you look, one of the greatest public policy triumphs of modern times is welfare reform in the mid-1990s. Welfare reform, where the Republican Congress came in and put work requirements on welfare, what happened is millions of people who were on welfare had to get a job, and it was the best thing that ever happened. If you look at the last election, I think 2012 was decided by 2 words, 47%. And by that, I don't mean Mitt Romney's comments, where Mitt Romney was filmed at a fundraiser saying the 47% who are in some ways dependent on government, who are not paying income tax, we don't have to worry about that. I think Mitt Romney is a good and decent man. But the narrative of the last election was we don't have to worry about it. The narrative, and I cannot think of a sentiment with which I disagree more strongly. I think Republicans are and should be the party of the 47%. The party of the people. We should want every person on food stamps, every person on welfare to be in a position where they can get a job. And listen, I believe the vast majority of Americans want to stand on their own feet. They want to provide for their family. You want to know, none of this is rocket science. Every grandmother in the country, every abuela, ask her, do you want your grandkid on welfare? You want your grandkids on food stamps? Every grandmother would say, no, of course not. I want them to get a job. I want them to work. I want them to raise their family. I want them to teach their kids. I want them to work hard. I mean, those are the values that have made this country strong. And that's what we need to be fighting to do, is not trapping people in dependency, but helping them stand on their own feet to achieve the American dream. Let me just wrap up, because I'm getting the hook from everyone, by saying thank you to you guys. I mean, listen, it is incredibly important that y'all are here, y'all are active. And I want to encourage you what you can do. How many of y'all know who James O'Keefe is? James O'Keefe, one young guy who went in with an undercover camera and has exposed over and over again, Acorn, just about shut the place down. It's exposed Battleground, Texas. has exposed one of my favorites on the question of voter ID and voter fraud. Went into D.C. and asked to vote. They said, "What's your name?" He says, "Eric Holder." They handed him Eric Holder's ballot. He says, "Do I need to show you an ID?" "Nope." I said, "My name's Eric Holder." "Well, Mr. Holder, here you go." Has it all on film. The power of, now that's one young person with an ID. I would encourage each of you, think about how to convey, how to reach out to your communities, how to reach out to young people, how to reach out to the Hispanic community. I'll tell you something, the Hispanic community, there are 2.3 million Hispanic small business owners in this country, 1 in 8 Hispanic households. Hispanic community, we are a profoundly entrepreneurial community who values hard work in the American dream. So we got to figure out how to communicate that message. That Obamacare and taxes and Dodd-Frank and regulation and environmental nuttiness is hammering small businesses and hurting people who are struggling. And that's where y'all can think about ways to communicate. And here's a final point I'll make. For young people, if you sat down and tried to design an agenda to totally hammer young people, I don't think you could come up with a more effective agenda than the Obama agenda. And here are 3 specific points that it's worth thinking about and sharing with your friends. Number 1, 4 consecutive years of less than 1% average growth. All of y'all coming out of school at a time when small businesses, which produce 2/3 of all new jobs, are not growing and are shrinking. Economists are referring to this generation of young people that just came out of school as a, quote, lost generation. Because if you don't get skills now in your first job, decades from now, that income effect will be with this generation of young people. It's now the skills you get right now that build the foundation for the job you have when you're 30 and when you're 40 and when you're 50. Number 2, Obamacare. One of the easiest ways to understand Obamacare, it is a massive wealth transfer from young, healthy people to everybody else. Part of Obamacare mandates that you can't have a differential in premiums based on age more than 3 to 1. Now the problem is, covering a 19-year-old man is a lot less expensive than covering a 62-year-old with serious health differences. And so what happened? What did Obamacare do? Well, let's jack up the premiums on all the young people to get them to subsidize the older people. 28-year-old man in Texas in the individual market, his premiums have already gone up on average 77%. It's happening all over the country. Young people are getting hit with it. And finally, our national debt. Our national debt has gone from $10 trillion when Obama was elected to over $17 trillion today. That's a 60% increase. It's larger than our entire economy. Who the heck do you think is going to pay for it? And yet young people voted 70-30 for Obama. I think every young person should have walked into the ballot box and punched their parents in the nose. But let me ask you, last cycle, when did any Republican ever explain this to young people? I don't remember the Romney campaign ever saying this. I mean, you can't fault young people for not having it just burst in their heads spontaneously. We've got to communicate it. And that was a failure of Republicans, but it's something y'all could do. One thing I'll point you to, Jimmy Kimmel, a couple of weeks ago, did a great fake ad, which if you haven't seen, you should go Google it. Just go Google Jimmy Kimmel Obamacare ad. And he did a fake ad of an older couple that are in their early 60s, and they're sort of dressed in like a preppy sweater, and they're in a pretty nice living room. And they're saying, I've got rheumatoid arthritis. And I take all sorts of expensive medicines. I take this, I take this, I take this. And boy, they're expensive. But I'm not really worried about it. Because, and they're talking to their grandkids, you're paying for it. And they say, why is that? Because you don't vote. And we do. So thanks a lot. Ta-ta. We're off to the golf course. It's worth watching the ad because, frankly, it communicates it better than anything I could say. So I would encourage you, pull up something like that, send it to your friends. It makes a very simple point, but also think creative about how to spread the message that freedom matters and that we want to live in an environment where small businesses can prosper and where opportunity is meaningful, where there's been no nation on earth that has allowed so many millions of people to start with nothing and achieve anything. And here's the final point I'll make in one sentence, the difference. Reaganomics. You start a business in your parents' garage. Obamanomics. You move into your parents' garage.